Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. We're all about getting past those surface level takes, right? Really digging into the stuff that matters. And today, today we're going somewhere you might not expect. It's quiet, but incredibly powerful. Silence in activism.
Yeah, it's kind of a paradox, isn't it? We've been diving deep into this article, and it really challenges how we think about silence, not just as the absence of sound, but as this active force shaping social movements.
It really makes you think. So, our big question for this deep dive is what's the real impact of silence on how activism works in our world today? I mean, it's not a simple question, there's so much to unpack. We want to look back at where it all started historically, how silence affects people and whole communities psychologically, how society views it, the consequences of staying silent. And this is key, how understanding all this can help us create more effective collective action. Where do we even begin with something this big?
Well, I think it's helpful to start by remembering that activism always exists within a certain context, right? Social, political, economic, all of that sets the stage. And when you look back in time, you see silence has been this, well, surprisingly versatile tool. It's been used both as a form of protest and also, maybe more subtly, as a way of sort of passively agreeing with the status quo, just going along with things.
Wow, that's interesting. The protest part, I get that. I can think of examples right away. But the agreement part, that's a little more complicated.
Yeah, for sure. Take the civil rights movement, for example. The article we looked at really highlighted those powerful vocal demands for equality that were coming from, African-American leaders and their allies. But then so often that was contrasted with this silence from so many white Americans.
And that silence wasn't just a neutral thing, right? It wasn't like people were just sitting on the sidelines. It really affected how quickly and in what direction things changed.
Exactly. That difference between like actively speaking up and choosing to stay silent. That had a huge impact on public opinion. It influenced the laws that were eventually passed. And while, the bravery of those who did speak out was so crucial, it galvanized the movement. The article argues that the collective silence of a big chunk of the population could also be interpreted as, well, almost as if they were okay with things staying the way they were.
Right. It was like their inaction was almost giving permission for the existing racial hierarchy, all those discriminatory practices, to just continue.
Exactly. It wasn't neutral at all. And you see a similar pattern with the women's suffrage movement. The article talks about the obvious resistance from the political systems. But then there was also this quieter opposition or just a lack of engagement from a significant part of society.
Yeah.
They created this climate where discrimination could just flourish because nobody was challenging it.
It makes you think about all that energy, all the passion that the suffragettes poured into their fight for rights. But if a big portion of society is just indifferent or silent, it almost undermines those efforts, right?
It definitely allows those harmful practices to continue. But there's another side to this, right? The article also highlights those feminist voices that really push back against that societal silence. I mean, especially the voices of women from marginalized groups. They were crucial to the movement's successes.
So it seems like breaking that silence, especially coming from those directly affected and those who stand with them, that's a huge part of pushing progress, while silence from others can really slow things down.
Exactly. And it's not just about looking back at history, right? The article makes the point that this understanding of silence is super relevant for activists today, like recognizing how both speaking up and staying silent can have an impact. That's really important for figuring out the best strategies for modern movements.
I see that. Okay, so that historical perspective really makes you think about silence in a new way. But let's get a little more personal here. Let's talk about the psychological impact on the people involved in activism. Because at the end of the day, social movements are all about people, right?
Right. And it's really striking how deeply silence can affect not only the activists themselves, but also the communities they're fighting for. The article talks about this intense sense of isolation that activists can experience, especially when their calls for change just seem to be met with indifference or apathy from society.
I can only imagine how disheartening it would be. You're pouring your heart and soul into this cause, but you feel like nobody's even listening.
It's really tough. It can create this sense of powerlessness. It leads to activists thinking, what's the point? My efforts are just disappearing into this void. And when you're dealing with issues as serious as social justice or inequality, people really crave that sense of collective recognition.
Yeah, it's like you're searching for confirmation that you're not alone in seeing this problem, and silence can feel like, well, like the opposite of that.
Totally. And the article highlights how silence coming from people who should be allies, from bystanders, from the broader community, that can be especially devastating. Activists might interpret that silence as a dismissal of their struggles, like their pain isn't even being acknowledged. And this creates emotional distance and, can lead to despair. And the impact doesn't stop with the individual activist.
Oh, right. The article talked about how that silence affects entire communities, right?
Yes, exactly. When people disengage because of silence, it weakens that sense of community, of shared identity. The article suggests that activists and marginalized groups might even start to internalize that lack of support, like it's somehow a reflection of their own worth. It's a heavy burden to carry.
It's a pretty bleak picture. It sounds like silence can really undermine the very core of a movement, the heart of it.
It can. The article points out how it can sap people's motivation, it can be harmful to their mental well-being, and it can make them less resilient overall. At its core, activism relies on solidarity, that feeling of shared purpose, that we're in this together. But when silence dominates, it can really cast a shadow over the hope for change.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine anything positive coming from that kind of environment. We've looked at the individual and community level, but let's zoom out a bit. How does society as a whole react to silence and social movements? I can't imagine it's one uniform reaction.
You're right, it's a really diverse landscape of responses. The article talks about how supporters of a cause might actually see silence in a positive light.
Really? How so?
Well, sometimes they view it as a deliberate strategy, a powerful way to draw attention to really blatant injustices, or to amplify the voices of those who are most marginalized, particularly when traditional methods of advocacy aren't working. For these supporters, silence can be a form of communication in itself, like a really strong statement, without using words.
Interesting. So it's almost like a pause that's meant to make you think, to highlight the seriousness of the issue.
Exactly. But then you have those who disagree with the cause, right? The detractors. And they often see that silence as a sign that you're not really committed, that you're maybe even complicit in what's happening. It seems like there's this societal expectation that activism has to be loud and visible.
Right. It's true, the image of the vocal protester, that's like the classic picture of activism. So if you're not out there shouting, some people might question how dedicated you really are.
They might doubt your sincerity. And critics will say that silence weakens a movement, makes it less visible. And then you have to think about the stigma that can come with being silent. The article talks about how that can make things even worse for people who already feel like they have to stay quiet, maybe because they're afraid of backlash or of being ostracized. That's a lot of internal conflict for those individuals.
It must be incredibly difficult to feel so strongly about something, but be too afraid to actually speak up about it.
It is. And then we have those who are kind of neutral on the issue, not for or against. The article points out that silence can confuse these folks. They might misinterpret it as a lack of interest or awareness about the issue, or even as apathy.
And that could really hurt a movement, right, if people don't even know it exists or don't understand what it's about.
Absolutely. It can make it harder for the movement to connect with the public and can ultimately weaken its impact. So the big takeaway here is that there are so many reasons why someone might be silent. It's not always because they don't care. And understanding all those different motivations is really important for creating a more inclusive dialogue, a more nuanced way of looking at collective action.
So we have to be careful about assuming we know why someone's being silent. There's a lot more to it than just thinking they don't care. So the article goes on to look at some real-world examples, right? Case studies where silence has actually blocked progress in activism.
It does, and these examples really show you how silence has a tangible impact on social movements. It looks at the Black Lives Matter movement, climate action, and women's rights advocacy, and shows how different forms of silence have held back progress in all three of those areas.
Okay, let's take Black Lives Matter first. What were some of the specific forms of silence that the article identified as being particularly harmful?
It points to a long history of silence from individuals, organizations, institutions, all in the face of racial injustice. And it gives examples of what happened after the deaths of Black individuals at the hands of law enforcement, like when important figures or institutions didn't strongly condemn what happened or support systemic change. It actually delayed those crucial conversations about police reform and addressing the deeper issues of systemic racism.
So it wasn't just that they didn't speak out against it, but that lack of action, that silence, actively slowed down the process of dealing with the root causes.
Yes, exactly. Activists working on the ground felt like that silence took away the urgency, and it just perpetuated this cycle of inaction. As a result, essential reforms were pushed back, and those deep-seated racial disparities continued.
Wow, that's really powerful. It shows you the consequences of staying silent. what about climate action? How does silence play out there?
Well, the article makes the point that the climate crisis demands, like, urgent action from everyone. But there have been so many cases where powerful players, especially certain corporations and governments, have just stayed silent or haven't done anything, despite all the scientific evidence and the growing urgency of the problem. It talks specifically about those big climate summits, where influential groups wouldn't commit to things like phasing out fossil fuels, and that often led to really weak agreements and policies that just weren't effective.
I see. So in that case, the silence or inaction was at least partly driven by those economic interests, right?
Hmm.
Those interests were more important than taking action on the environment.
That seems to be a major factor, yeah. And the article emphasizes that the consequence of that silence is a weakening of public pressure. It makes it much harder to hold these powerful groups accountable, and ultimately, it makes it harder to fight climate change effectively.
It's a frustrating situation for sure. And what about women's rights advocacy? What's an example of silence acting as a barrier there?
The article focuses on the silence around sexual harassment and gender discrimination. Historically, that silence has done a lot of damage. It's empowered perpetrators and allowed inequalities to become ingrained in our systems. The hashtag #MeToo movement really brought all of that to the surface. That initial silence, driven by fear, self-doubt, societal pressure, all of that contributed to a culture where harassment was seen as normal and victims were often afraid to speak out.
It's really hard to think about how many people carried those experiences in silence for years, for decades even.
It's heartbreaking. But the article points out this really important shift. It wasn't until a large number of voices started breaking that silence that the movement gained real momentum, that it started to create real change. It's a powerful example of what can happen when people speak out together.
These case studies are really eye-opening. They show that silence isn't just the absence of noise. It can be a real obstacle to progress in so many important areas. So, what are the broader implications of this silence? The article talks about missed opportunities, doesn't it?
It does. And this is where it really lays out those long-term consequences of inaction. When people or groups choose to stay silent on big issues, it weakens the power of collective action. One of the main consequences is that it becomes much harder to build those strong coalitions.
That makes sense. If people aren't talking openly about their concerns, their perspectives, their willingness to get involved, it's hard to find common ground, to unite around shared goals.
Right. Without those shared goals, that coordination, social movements can lose their momentum and fail to create real, lasting change. And the article points out that silence also limits the range of stories and perspectives that are being heard.
Because everyone has their own unique experiences and insights, right?
Exactly. And when those diverse voices are missing from the conversation, activism loses some of its impact. It misses those opportunities to create broader, more inclusive stories that can connect with more people and foster empathy and understanding.
So silence can lead to a kind of tunnel vision where a movement loses sight of the bigger picture.
That's a great way to put it. And the article also stresses how silence undermines that crucial work of raising awareness. If people aren't speaking up about issues, they're missing chances to inform others, to inspire them to get involved. And raising awareness is often the first step towards creating real social change.
And historically, as the article mentions, there are countless examples where that collective silence has meant missing out on opportunities to advocate for change and push for reforms. It makes you wonder what could have been achieved if more people had spoken up earlier and more consistently.
It really does. The article ends by saying that silence can create this echo chamber where growth is limited and it becomes much harder to address those urgent societal issues. When you think about what could have been done with more widespread engagement, the cost of inaction becomes pretty clear.
It's a good reminder that silence isn't neutral. It has real consequences, and they're often negative, especially when it comes to social justice. So the big question then is, how do we actively break this silence? The article gives us some strategies, right?
It does. And it emphasizes that since activism needs dialogue and communication to thrive, breaking those cycles of silence is absolutely crucial for creating meaningful change. The first strategy it highlights is creating accessible platforms for conversation.
Spaces where people feel safe and comfortable sharing their opinions without fear of being judged or silenced.
Exactly. That could look like a lot of things. Community forums, online campaigns that are designed to encourage respectful conversation, even local events that bring in a diverse range of voices. The goal is to build environments where everyone feels welcome to speak their mind and be heard.
What else does the article suggest?
It talks about the power of storytelling, sharing personal experiences, those human stories related to social issues. that can create a connection that facts and statistics sometimes can't. By encouraging people to share their stories through blogs, podcasts, public speaking, it can create empathy and build a sense of understanding and momentum.
Because when you hear someone's personal story, it makes the issue real. You can't just dismiss it as something abstract or irrelevant anymore.
Exactly. The article also talks about the importance of collaborating with other groups. Partnering with established organizations like nonprofits or community groups can amplify the impact of individual efforts. You're sharing resources, networks, influence, all of that helps challenge systemic silence more effectively.
It's about leveraging that existing infrastructure to broaden the reach of individual efforts.
Exactly. And the article highlights how important it is to promote inclusivity and diversity within activist groups themselves. The more voices and experiences you have at the table, the richer the dialogue will be, and the more effective the strategies will be for addressing silence and injustice.
It makes sense that a movement that's all about breaking silence needs to embrace all kinds of voices and actively seek out those who are often marginalized.
Absolutely. And lastly, the article talks about having educational workshops and training programs. Those can equip people with the skills and knowledge they need to speak up and be more effective activists.
So it's about giving people the tools and the understanding they need to find their voice and use it to challenge silence.
Yes, and the article ends on this hopeful note. It says that by putting these strategies into action, we can move away from a culture dominated by silence and towards a culture where lots of voices are empowered to create real, positive change.
That's a really encouraging and practical set of ideas. Now, we can't talk about breaking silence and activism without talking about allies, right? Their role is crucial, and the article talks about this specifically.
It does, and it emphasizes how important allies are in the fight against silence and activism. Their job is to amplify the voices of those who are often marginalized, to make sure their concerns are heard, especially when those groups lack power or a platform.
So it's not enough to just agree with the cause, right?
Yeah.
You have to actively use your privilege and your platform to lift up others and make sure their voices are part of the conversation.
Exactly. And the article makes it clear that real allyship requires active listening. You have to really engage with and understand the systemic issues that make it hard for marginalized groups to speak up. It requires a commitment to learning and growing. One of the actions the article suggests is creating inclusive spaces for dialogue.
Spaces where those who are often overlooked or silenced are not just present, but are really the focus of the conversation.
Yes, and allies can use their privilege and resources to help create these spaces, community forums, workshops, online platforms, where people feel safe and empowered to share their stories without fear of judgment. The article makes this really important point. The role of the ally is not to lead these conversations or speak for others, but to support the dialogue that's already happening, to help create the space for those with lived experience to lead the way.
That's such an important distinction. It's about being supportive, not taking over.
Exactly. And the article also calls on allies to be active advocates for change in their own communities and networks. That means taking concrete steps against the status quo and the systems that create inequality, whether that's participating in protests, contacting policymakers, educating others. Allies can use their resources and connections to have a broader impact.
So it's about challenging silence and working for justice wherever you have a voice and where your actions can make a difference.
Yes, and the article wraps up by saying that challenging silence isn't a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process. It requires a commitment to learning and growing as an ally, and to working to dismantle those systems that keep people silent. By working together, by amplifying those diverse voices, allies can make a huge difference in the fight for equity and justice.
This has been such a fascinating look at a concept that we don't always think about, but that has such a powerful influence. Silence and activism, it's not passive at all. It can hold back progress, but when it's broken, it can be a force for real change. As we wrap up, let's just go over some of those key takeaways one more time.
Sure. The article makes it clear that silence in activism has huge implications. We talked about how it can often be seen as complicity, and it can actually allow injustice to continue. And in today's world, where there are so many pressing social issues, the need for vocal advocacy is more important than ever.
It's a good reminder that silence doesn't just affect the people who are silenced. It holds back progress for everyone.
Exactly. And the article makes this point. Every single person has the potential to create positive change, but we have to have the courage to speak up for that potential to be realized. History is full of examples of movements that were built by the voices of people who dared to challenge oppression and break the silence.
As we talked about, activism needs open and honest dialogue. When people engage in these conversations, it raises awareness and can inspire others to join in.
The big message of the article is this. We need to create a culture where different opinions and experiences are not just tolerated, but welcomed and sought out. That's how we build accountability, transparency, and ultimately, justice.
So it all starts with awareness, right? Understanding the issues and the impact of silence. The article encourages all of us to find ways to get involved in our own communities, whether that's attending meetings, joining groups, or even just using our voices responsibly online.
Because at the end of the day, when we break the silence and amplify the voices of those who have been marginalized, we create a more equitable and just society for everyone. We all have a part to play in becoming vocal advocates for positive change, to make sure that silence never stands in the way of progress and justice.
That's a really powerful message to end on. And on that note, here's something for you to think about. Where in your own life, in your work, in your community, might silence be allowing problems to continue or even get worse? What's one small but meaningful step you could take today to start a conversation, to amplify a voice that's not being heard, or to challenge something that's not right? You might be surprised by how much of a difference you can make. Thanks for joining us for this important deep dive.